So this question is called incentive scheme. So let's say that you're working on the Uber app. How would you design an incentive scheme for drivers such that they would be more likely to go into city areas where demand is high?
Interesting problem. And I think, first of all, let's define how do we basically see the inherent situation in here. For example, what are the specific goals of this incentive scheme? I mean, is it more just like pure number of drivers in the high demand area, or like reduce the wait times for riders, or maybe the percentage of like completed rides? I think first of all, we need to like find that North Star. And of course, I mean, the way that our incentive works may not be obviously related to that, but as a secondary effect, I mean, it will eventually lead to like moving that North Star metric that we care about. So I think that's the first step to understand what we care about most. I mean, if, for example, even it could be as easy as like, not as easy, but as kind of defined as customer satisfaction, because the more that customers or riders see that they're like, they have to wait, I mean, they're maybe rides are being canceled, and kind of seeing that frustration, that's something and you can probably get some signals out of that, and eventually we'll need to run some churn. But in a way, it may be harder to like gauge that or kind of measure that in the short term or immediately. So I would probably go with something more tangible and easier and basically faster to measure. Maybe something like the percentage of completed ride. I mean, basically rides over demand, something like that in those areas as something that we're trying to optimize.
Okay.
And on the other hand, let me understand the problem. And is it the question? Is it like happening mostly during the commute time? Are there particular patterns to that? I mean, is it like a repetitive situation? For example, in downtown area, a particular city, every day in rush hour, we see the situation and it's always there. Or is it more applicable and problematic in, like, let's say if there's an event, a sport event or like entertainment event in particular arena, and then you want to like basically satisfy that? I think we need to probably distinguish between like different types of reasons behind those demand surge, because the way that we handle that could be different, and the way that we plan for them also could be different. And another thing to figure out is, do we have constraints? I mean, do we have budget constraints, or is it something that, you know what, because of the reputation of the company, there's a strategic support, and at least for the time being, we don't have to like worry about that constraints. I think that could be another input to this problem. Another question to again help us figure out the situation is that, do we have like historical data about driver behavior? I mean, understanding how drivers would react when they see demands or rides requests from basically high demand areas or like high traffic areas. Is there any pattern basically to those historical data? So I think we can learn a lot by looking at some past events and maybe some reputations and see, okay, is it a particular theme that's happening over and over? I mean, from driver's response, from like riders response. I mean, do we see a lot of like cancellations? I mean, do we see basically elongated wait time? And do we have also like signals maybe from surveys that, if we have done surveys, or maybe we should actually do, asking about like what motivates them to maybe even like sacrifice a little bit of time and go to high traffic areas and high demand areas, and the caveats around that. I think getting that signals either implicitly or explicitly will help us understand, first of all, I mean, the inherent problem going on and what potentially could be something that is going to be like interesting for drivers, I mean, to get hooked onto. Let me do a milestone check. Do you, I mean, anything else that did for context definition or like problem definition that I may have missed, or like in terms of context?
No, I think the problem with context is good. It just kind of depends on which path you want to go down now. Is there something that you want to set in terms of the scope of answering this problem again?
Sure. In terms of scope of the problem, I think, first of all, looking at those historical data, identifying some patterns, and first of all, and before then, setting a, let's say, North Star or a goal that eventually, if we implement the incentive program, how we can tell that this is going to be a successful program. I think, let's say, basically acceptance rate, it could be one metric that we can basically think of. But of course, I mean, there might be other guardrail as well, to look, and there could be a suite of metrics, if you may. This particular problem, at least for now, I don't think of a predictive model, although, it could turn into a predictive model potentially. But at this point, it's more like an ideation of, okay, how we can implement a program, how we can come up with different potentially useful ideas, but then how we can measure the impact. I think the second part of the problem that is going to be more interesting and maybe more even relevant to data science and analytics is going to be how we can measure the success. We can dive into, this could be just like purely observational studies, monitoring the data, monitoring the trend, but the bigger problem that I think it's going to be in the scope of this problem is it really the effect of our incentive program, or is it just like correlation? Is it just like happened? So I think we want to isolate the incremental effect of our incentive program on the like the metric, on the goal that we care about. So I think that that's something that will happen after we come up with the right incentive.
So specifically here, let's talk about the actual design, right? And maybe give an example of like what we would do for the incentive and then what the results would look like so that we can make it more tangible, sorry, on what the incentive program would actually look like.
Sure. I think the bottom line is that we need to understand drivers' motivations and something that helped them, to get to their own goal. And it could, eventually it's monetization. They want to basically see the monetary value. At the same time, we want to balance the effort to get to that monetary value. I think that's how, for example, as an established scenario, we can increase base fares for high demand areas. Even like without a surge, we can start at the higher rates. And when it's rush hour or when it's like particular event, we can basically add like surge price at like a multiplier. And it can be informed by, let's say, the overall traffic in the area. We can see the trend of ETAs of like completed rides in that area and use that as proxy, as an input to basically coming up with that surge multiplier. So something like that. It could be model based, it could be maybe like very simplistic rule based, but we need some logic to come up with that dynamic pricing and basically surge multiplier. Another interesting thing, they call it gamification or like quests or challenges, something like that. You let's say if you complete first 10 rides in like basically some so-called red areas or high demand areas, you get like the first badge, and maybe the second milestone like after 50 rides, something like that. The kind of a badge of honor that will add to their profiles, and also like people can see as well, that eventually can be monetized. Maybe eventually we'll provide them some discount or other services or partner services like Uber Eats. Maybe we can use that for, even if we see that a driver is consistently helping us and basically achieving those milestones, can we consider maybe changing their commission rate because they're like true partner for us? In those hardships, they basically help us, but can we look at them differently, a more premium driver, if you may? So I think some of them should be short term, just immediately hook them into like those incentives that say, okay, the price is higher, maybe makes sense, to just get involved in that situation. And some of them could be more loyalty focused and long-term incentive focused to just like get them engaged, not necessarily just like one-time thing, and then they stay motivated to just like basically do the rides in high demand areas.
So we know that there's short-term and long-term kind of incentives here. Is there any way that we can iterate to an optimal approach here? How do we know if we got it good and we don't need to change anything after testing like a few of these? Where do we go after? Yeah, how would we even run these tests, essentially?
Yeah, testing and the effect is something, but saying that it's going to be optimal is something else. I think it's going to be much harder to claim that, this is at least close to like universal optimal or global optimal for this particular problem, because there are potentially a lot of non-linearities and blind spot and very basically variables that it's hard to observe. But at least for the sake of argument, what we can do is obviously monitor the performance and see if this is actually helping us or hurting us. Or in a different scenario, can we benchmark different incentive scenario, different incentives. Let's say if we implement an incentive in a city, city A, and then another type of incentive is city B, can we benchmark them and see at least some sort of experimentation? So in ideal perfect world, I mean, people would suggest, okay, let's do some sort of A/B testing and experimentation to do that, and it's valid, but of course, I mean, there's a lot of like potential issues with that. I mean, there's having the right level of like exposure control and making sure that these are like really truly apple to apple comparison is a little bit tough, and setting up experiment also can be costly as well, maybe like losing a lot of opportunities for the control group. What we can do is, let's say, I mean, depending on the situation, there are so many ways. I start with some natural observation or natural experiment or like observational studies. There's a whole suite of like causal inference methodologies that we can use. For example, if we have like two similar cities or areas and we monitor like the trend of that particular metric throughout the past year or so, if we can tell that the overall trend for these two areas or these two cities are similar, but then we introduce that particular change and incentive at like basically the time zero, but then the method called diff and diff, you can basically kind of calculate the incremental effect of this particular intervention compared to like the presumed control, which is not a real control experiment, but at least, I mean, the most that you can isolate them based on the differences, you can actually calculate the incremental outcome, incremental result because of the incentive program. Or like something like regression discontinuity. Let's say if you have like the trend of your rides and then your metric that you care about, you introduce that shift or that the change, and then by comparing the counterfactual, which is basic continuation of the prior trend and then the new trend, you can potentially tell, okay, what is the incremental effect of this new thing? Of course, it suffers from some of the limitations because you may kind of overlook some of the other external factors that may happen right after that. I think it's not a perfect method, but at least in lieu of like a true randomized experimentation, that's something that people do just for observation. So there are so many like potential like observational studies that you can use, either like A to B benchmark or just like incentive versus non-incentive to gauge the effect of your incentive program. And then, of course, it can be an iterative process to your point. Then you can come up with the second scenario or maybe augment the successful scenario with some additional incentives, maybe some additional elements. Maybe you start with short term, but then in the next step, when you see incremental value, then you introduce like the long-term incentive and see if this is combination altogether led to basically more success for the platform.
I think that's good. Let's do a quick retro on this one as well, because I kind of like this question and I think it's interesting comparatively to like more of a model building one or more of a typical analysis question. So what did you think of it?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I mean, it's interesting because it's not very straightforward. Even from the conception, understanding the root cause of the problem and coming up with a scenario. While I mean, it is more like a product owner problem, but there are many analytics aspect to that. I mean, from the beginning, analyzing the market behavior trend and understanding, okay, I mean, what is the problematic area that I should focus on, or learning from the past. I mean, understanding some behaviors and some trends that kind of govern people's or riders and drivers behavior. I think there are interesting analytics problems lying in there. Coming up with the right incentive would be combination of analytics people and like product owners and like business stakeholders. But eventually, I think the hardest part is the benchmark and the evaluation of the program. Because when you see changes, everybody can claim that, you know what, this is because of the program and we were successful and like basically celebrate. But the problem is that you need to isolate that effect. I think that that's where it is typically tougher and than the typical machine learning modeling benchmark when it comes to like understand the causality and true incremental effect of a change that you introduce.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the implementation here also would be helped by kind of a design story in a sense, right? Where we're at least crafting an idea of what the next step is in implementing something like this, right? Where we at least understand what the success, you know, looks like, and we know what optimal success looks like, which is kind of that meeting of like what you said, right? Like we have a standard Uber ride acceptance rate, right? On the rider side. And we have a standard baseline, driver acceptance rate on their side, right? And we have, you know, obviously rider supply and
Mm-hmm.
demand and driver supply and demand that we want equalized, right? So understanding that we have this kind of target and then we can shift the variables up and down to kind of
Mm-hmm.
meet that and spend the least amount of money kind of getting there, I guess, in some sense, is kind of one of those ways
Mm-hmm.
that we can at least craft it into more of, again, a black box of kind of like, these are the things we can try to get this result. But then the actual implementation side is where we kind of go into the technical details that you were talking about around, let's run difference and difference testing, right? Or let's test this maybe additional ideas we're testing in different markets with different similar markets, but different ones where we're testing different techniques, right? Just in case there's general network effects that are going to happen in the same
Mm-hmm.
city, right? So I do think that there's some like general core levels of technical analysis that you have to understand for this. At the end of the day, if you have the general framework and the structure of like how we're going to apply the problem solving techniques here and how we're going to frame the problem solving analysis here from start to finish, it's not too tough of a question. I think the general feedback is that like it's hard to, it's there's again, there's a lot of different directions that you can go with this problem. And sometimes it is helpful to have like specific edge cases or at least common use cases where we can kind of center a lot of our problems to be solving for that main use case. And so if I say, the most popular one, right, is there's like a concert or an event somewhere, Uber knows that it's happening. How do we like solve for this main use case and make sure the drivers go to this area? On the short term side, it's about, seeing how many of them we can just notify to get them over there, or is more of the problem going to be like actually giving them like, an actual reward, right? Like, is it an actual reward problem, or is it like a notification driver supply problem even? Right. And that's where the scope can get a little bit larger, right? Because we know that, maybe the city literally just doesn't have enough drivers for like a huge conglomeration of an event, and we just need to acquire more drivers at that point,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So again, we do kind of need to scope it down, but it is helpful to label a lot of those like assumptions up front.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why, I mean, at the beginning, I mentioned that, I mean, of course, the nature of problem could be different. I mean, it could be one-time thing, and the way
Yeah.
that you handle that is a little bit different. But I think key to implement all of them is like visibility, transparency, and communication with drivers. Because at the end of the day, you don't want it to necessarily be a secret thing or like magic box or something like that. You
Yeah.
want to just like let them know, you know what, this is why you're getting this kind of incentive, and this is like it's obvious from their side that okay, what's happening? I mean, this particular event is happening and there is like this amount of need, and then this is going to be your rewards, I mean, for filling that need. I mean, the same for like all the reoccurring stuff and like repetitive situations like rush hour, that they clearly understand the mechanics of that. They get the timely notification that even if they forget, oh yeah, let's be prepared for that. Let me just like drive to that area and to get to just like even before getting involved with the rush hour. So I think with that transparency and visibility, you can implement it maybe more seamlessly, and that is gain more satisfaction on the driver side as well.
Yeah, definitely.